Welcome back to Radically Rethinking Railways in Australia with your ever-present host, the Mad Professor. Viewers who haven't seen the previous 10 episodes, look for the links in the description below. As this series moves on, viewers will find the different threads beginning to tie together into a single story, how you, the viewer, have been misled in so many ways about the Australian railways by false narratives. We've been all over the world in recent episodes, whether it be to wartime France, or ancient China, or modern Sweden and Morocco, to help destroy these false narratives. But today, we are back in the classroom, and that is to look at the subject of economics, and specifically the idea of money that is misused to make false narratives about Australian railways. This could be excusing the murder of an Australian railway, like the Healesville line we saw in episode 3. It might also be to help the bureaucrats justify their policy chaos and incompetence, like we saw in episode 4 on how Australian bureaucrats don't develop rational policy, but just muddle through. Or in our last episode on mainline electrification, they tell us Australian railways have no money for such luxuries when underpopulated, sparsely settled places like Sweden obviously do. Today's lecture is not on economics. We could do a dozen such episodes and barely scratch the surface. And like good students, you need to do your own reading or listening. 2 good links are listed below. One to a great podcast series called Hidden Forces by Dimitri Kofinas, and the other a great read or listen is The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton for more modern monetary theory. So rather than cover economic theory, your Mad Professor will cover a series of messages, and we will support them with examples, but viewers will benefit by, as they say, doing their own research. You probably believe a pack of falsehoods about money, and the role of money in Australian railways, and that is no surprise, because a whole industry has grown up in putting these lies about. Once upon a time, a rail CEO in the 1870s, like John Whitton of the New South Wales Government Railways, might persuade the Minister for Railways to put forward a new railway line. Then Cabinet and Parliament would vote on it. Then skilled contractors would build it and Treasury would pay them. Whitton's time had no media advisors, no consultants, no resident Treasury economists, no corporate planners, or others who would steal Whitton's budget and put out narratives to justify not building the railways. But we have these types of people today, and you've probably seen their work. Like Rome and Gaul in the time of Caesar, today's episode is split into 3 parts. Do Australian railways really have a shortage of money? Is money even real? And if money is not real, then what is the real problem with Australian railways? Let's get started. To understand the notion that the Australian railways have money, or don't, we need to drill deeper into the topic. First, accountants understand that spending on railways can be classified as operating expenditure and capital expenditure. Operating expenditure is the spending on labour and other expenses such as fuel, consumables, basic maintenance, the bureaucracy, and other short-run outgoings. Capital expenditure, on the other hand, is generally those new things like new lines, upgrades to existing lines, rolling stock, new signalling systems, computers, and so on that make the system capable of doing more than it previously could. Railways also earn income from the sale of the services, such as the conveyance of freight or passengers, though in the case of passengers, that income may not, in an accounting sense, cover the expenses, nor will it be enough to cover the interest on borrowed funds. So government must step in and top up that spending. Colloquially, this is called losing money. Remember in our 3rd episode, Henry Bland said that the Healesville Railway was losing money, equivalent in those days to the value of 3 suburban houses each year. But losing money in the Healesville context makes it sound like that money was being spent on the line but was somehow going missing, as if those bureaucrats were watching the unintentional spending of money. In that case, those bureaucrats were delinquent and should have been sacked. But there was nothing unintentional nor fraudulent about the money spent on the Healesville line. It was being deliberately spent and going into the pockets of the drivers who drove the train, the guards and the station staff, the men who maintained the line, and the rolling stock it used. Money that went into their communities to pay shopkeepers, teachers, doctors, and others. Nothing at all lost about that money. This is accountants talking as if they were economists when they were not. However, let's keep in mind, this government funding for deficits is a two-way street, as the railways as businesses may not be allowed to cover the full cost of passenger services, even if it was possible, for example, by raising fares or reducing the expenditure to more efficient levels. So asking the question of how much money Australian railways have, we should look at it several ways. What is it now, and was the total expenditure, both operating and capital, on Australian railways? Ignoring the revenue railways earn themselves, how much government funding is now, and was historically, required to cover deficits? How do we evaluate whether that was reasonable? Which in turn requires us to think, what is reasonable? And this is the crux. In the good old days, and let's imagine that to be the 1950s, when Australian railways were starting to feel the competition from road and air, but were yet to embark on significant closures of lines, would be a good place to start. A large system, like the New South Wales Government Railways, or a small one, like the Tasmanian Government Railways, were huge organisations within their jurisdictions. 1 in 10 Tasmanian men of employment age worked for the Tasmanian Government Railways. Think about that. They were employed just moving things around, and those things generally meant seasonal agricultural produce, a few passenger trains, and mining output, which has always been important in Tasmania, but which was puny by today's standards. But it required 1 in 20 Tasmanian adult men to do it. Men who could have been doing other things, from growing more agricultural output, or mining more dirt, or maybe doing complex international financial deals, like they would have been doing in another small jurisdiction like Luxembourg, or maybe not. Depends on what you think Tasmanians are capable of. But they weren't doing these things, they were moving stuff around on steel rails. Although the TGR did not require a massive deficit to be covered, that is almost besides the point. The shippers and passengers of Tasmania, and its citizens generally, were paying the cost of all this inefficiency through economic output foregone. If we move up to a much larger state with a larger rail network, we still see the same pattern. Much rail traffic was to move either seasonal crops, or mining output, or some general goods, or passengers, and yet it kept so many people employed, a huge percentage of the employed labour force of men 18 to 65 at that time. And this is not making the stuff, or paying Australia's other bills. This is just moving the stuff around within New South Wales or Australia. In our last episode, we looked at the old government archive records and saw that even though the New South Wales electrification projects were expensive, they were expected to save money, and had they been properly built, they would have saved money that could have been put in your pocket, or maybe your ancestors' pockets, and it might be yours now, but it isn't there because an earlier government refused to create money. We can't lose sight of how in the 1950s this would have been sensitive, as many of those people would have lived through the Great Depression, and were glad that at least people were employed, even if the wiser ones could see how wasteful so much of it was. One theme we will come back to in this episode is that you always pay, whether it is to run these bloated railways, or you pay to make them efficient, or you pay to cover the unemployment payments if you don't employ people. As the economist Milton Friedman would say, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And this pride in large organisations and fear of mass unemployment fed into another false narrative, one that we will cover in a future episode. And that is the narrative made famous by the author Patsy Adams Smith, who your mad professor despises. This narrative holds that it was a glorious thing that vast numbers of staff were employed up and down the country, in every little nook and cranny of the land, in the vast wheat fields, or the mountain logging camps, in the mainline junction stations, or the railway workshops, or even in the city bureaucracies. It wasn't, but you will learn more how this self-serving narrative has made reform harder in a future episode. Your mad professor has been in the government archives and other places, looking at what things actually costed over the years, noting that measuring inflation is fraught for time series longer than a few years. Viewers will be familiar with the most common inflation measure that is reported, and that is the Consumer Price Index, which is based on a basket of consumer goods and what it costs in nominal terms over many years. Unfortunately, it is what it says it is, a consumer price index, and is not a very good measure of a complex topic of what railways cost to run, as your average railway does not run on cornflakes or toilet paper the way a household budget does. We can also look at weekly earnings as a way of understanding labour costs, which does give us a better handle on railway operations. We are then confronted with both the complexity but also the revelation. If labour costs in the past appeared excessive, perhaps they were. We can then look at government bond rates expressed in real terms, that is, clear of inflation, to see whether the cost of capital to government was relatively expensive or not. When the first Australian railway was built, from Sydney to Parramatta, it was built to serve a population of only 300,000 people in the colony, but by 1900, the rail network had grown 13,000%, and the population had grown only 130%. Clearly, there were more kilometres of railway per person than in 1855. A working population, who could not have exceeded 716,000, built a rail network of 4,000 kilometres across the state, funded by debt they believed they could service, and to be paid off by collecting revenue from the shippers and passengers, on an economy a mere fraction of the size it is now. So if they had the money, why wouldn't we? I could tell you the railway's budget in 1957 was in decimal currency terms 160 million. But as we observed, making that into real terms is pretty hard. The Reserve Bank's online calculator suggests that would be $2.8 billion in 2022, but your mad professor does not place much weight on that number. A bigger question is what proportion of state economic output that was, and what the similar ratio is now, and here's the answer. Much of the equivalent economic activity the railways once absorbed has gone into road transport, but again I suspect not all of it, and much of it has gone into the rest of the economy, into the pockets of consumers and profits for business, and that is a good thing. But if we want to have it back on rail, we clearly can. These things are all about choices government can make. They often chose not to make these choices, or to just muddle through, but it is a choice. It's only bureaucratic cowardice when they don't want to make these choices. This is why they need false narratives, to make you believe they had no choice when they do. Your mad professor does not want to see product or people back on rail if it is wasteful, but equally, we do not want them to not be on rail merely based on the lies of bureaucrats. We know they are lies because of what we see elsewhere, whether it is high-speed rail in Morocco, or mainline electric trains in Sweden, small mountain railways in Switzerland, or heavy freights in the back blocks of the USA, all done against the wisdom of our bureaucrats. We've just covered how, in an accounting sense, the money has always been there for Australian railways, but what about the reality of money? If we think back to the movie The Matrix, where the narrator Morpheus asks the hero Neo rhetorically, "What if I told you this world wasn't real?" Or in our case, what if I told you money wasn't real? You can sense deep down, as Neo did in The Matrix, that money isn't real, in the way that a loaf of bread or a house is real. We only value it because other people value it. We know this with gold. It has value because of the collective assessment of millions of people as to how much gold, by weight, is equivalent to other things that we need, like food, clothes, and shelter. This house, listed on the Domain website, is worth at the time of recording 1,000 ounces of gold. And if you don't take advantage of this, someone else will. But most of the money we use is not valued in this way. We have governments who set the value of money, and we call these governments the sovereign. The sovereign is like the computer running the matrix. It too plays by many of the rules of money, having to balance the debits and credits, the way we have to when we receive our income and pay our bills. The government is constrained by law, as are we, not to steal, not to give money to people unless for a good or service, and can also borrow or lend money just as we can. How the sovereign gets money, though, is very different from how we do as citizens in the economy. The government does not get its money from citizens, nor does it spend the money it receives. You probably believe it does, because economists and lawyers, like railway bureaucrats, have also been spreading false narratives. They tell you this to cover for decisions they made which you don't like, including closing uneconomic railways or cutting unemployment benefits or other such things. Government does not get its money from citizens, it creates money out of thin air. When God created the world in the Latin Bible, he said fiat lux, or let there be light. Governments do this too. It's called fiat money, and it is a very easy process. A government creates a reserve bank, like our one or the US Federal Reserve. It then says to this bank, lend me money. So the government treasury issues a bond or a promise to pay to the bank, and the bank advances cash to the government, who then spend the money on their own salaries or other contracts with the private sector. They don't issue literal banknotes, though they did do that in the past. When those salaried workers or contractors in turn spend that money in the private sector, it multiplies, as people are turning what were called promises to pay by the government into actual payments. Because the government could keep creating money up to infinity, the potential for all these promises to exceed the amount of goods and services available to buy is very real and would cause inflation. So governments cannot do this. They need a way to destroy money just as they create it, and this is called taxation. Government takes money off you as a person or business, and it is not used again. There are good reasons, starting from basic principles, to imagine the sovereign wants to keep money creation and money destruction in balance, to avoid inflation. And that is in fact why the government keeps its accounts and opens them to the public by law. That is, to give the public confidence that money is being created and destroyed in known amounts. However, you know in your heart of hearts that the value of money is whatever you believe the government is giving to it. If you were around in 2009 when Kevin Rudd and Wayne Swan gave you a cheque for $1,000 for doing absolutely nothing, but you know it was done by law and from the government accounts, then you believed the $1,000 was worth what it said, $1,000. Whereas, if a kind man on the street you'd never met pulled out his chequebook and wrote you a cheque for $1,000, you have no idea what he was good for, maybe zero. You could try giving this cheque from this man to a third person, and they might believe its face value, or maybe not. The lesson? Money is worth what you believe it is. Sovereigns create fictitious money, and you believe it is worth something, because they went through some theatrics, passing laws, voting in Parliament, publishing accounts, debating taxes. Also, you could believe the money has a specific value. Modern monetary theory asserts that being distracted by the value of fictitious money is taking you away from the real issue. And what is that? That is the real productive capacity of the economy. This is real economics, not the fiction that some people think is economics, but is really finance. Instead, we want to know the impact of real things, like capital equipment and labour on our railways. What people and equipment are we deploying, and what do we get back? Our railways that are privately owned must budget to make a profit from funds they either borrowed from financial institutions or raised as investments. They budget their expenses and revenue. But most of our railways are either government owned or government funded, and this means the sovereign. Who is the sovereign? In Australia it is complex, but in short it is the federal government. Although this is a government convention rather than a law, as in practice Australian states can wager their value on world markets, but they cannot set the value of the Australian dollar the way the federal government can. The fighting over this in the 1930s was a big thing in the history of Australian railways, and led to the collapse of the government of Jack Lang, and very nearly a civil war and a fascist takeover. New South Wales owed money to world capitalists and refused to pay, leading to federal intervention and a convention that states would not borrow outside a limit set by the federal government. John Bradfield was a bureaucrat lionised in Australian rail history for his scheme to expand the Sydney railways underground and across the harbour. But by 1932, the cost had nearly bankrupted the state. According to this paper by the Grattan Institute, see the link below, the calculations done in the 1920s to justify the scheme seemed reasonable, at around $60 billion if it were done today. Only that they couldn't foresee the economic collapse that took place. So it is important to understand that if we want to move the sovereign away from restrained spending on railways, it is the federal government we are talking about more than the states. So the federal government can spend more on railways than it taxes. Yes, and it does, and it should, without worrying about its so-called budget. It instead needs to look at productive capacity. Economists often play silly games in the bureaucracy. One is called the benefit-cost ratio, or BCR. Many members of the public have been deliberately misled using this tool into thinking that some capital project is worth doing, or not, based on a magic number. The most laughable example was the AECOM report done for Anthony Albanese into a high-speed rail project, which came back with the magic number of 1.0. In other words, in AECOM's estimation, the benefits would exactly equal the costs. This is the bureaucratic way of saying, we don't care whether you do the project or not. You could do it, or not, and the result would be the same. Does that seem right to you? A giant 1,300 kilometre scar across the landscape, but many millions of people riding through that landscape at high speed, doing new jobs, enjoying new activities, or relocating their homes. Thousands employed on the scheme. Yet AECOM says it's exactly the same as if the whole thing did not exist. For this fiction, AECOM pocketed $20 million from the government to say we don't care what you do. This is highway robbery. There is much wrong with the design of the high-speed rail in that report, and that alone makes the calculation likely wrong. But that is not the point of today's episode. We will cover that in a future one. Had Albanese gone out and said, based on their coin flip, well, I have decided we will have the high-speed rail, it would have been built by now, and Australia would have been a very different place. But the bureaucracy needed a false narrative to peddle why we can't have high-speed rail, and AECOM took the government shilling to provide one. Your mad professor suspects that AECOM was battling two forces, a minister like Albo who did want the project, hence the report concedes you can have it if you like. But central bureaucracies like Treasury and the Prime Minister's departments didn't, hence the equivocation. In truth, economics was supposed to be our servant and not our master, and bureaucrats too were supposed to be servants, public servants. And if Albo wanted high-speed rail, they should have found a way to couch the plan for it, to make it a good use of government funds. Noting that the $100 billion that it might have cost us is all fictitious money, but the equipment, land and labour that it would require as capital and operating expenses are all very real. The question for us is whether that land, labour and capital would be best used on high-speed rail rather than other things, and the answer is certainly. Like the Moroccans, we have more than our fictitious money to spend. We could have allowed those foreign workers we didn't already have, those who maybe had skills to build the high-speed rail that we lack, into the country to build the line, from Japan, France or Spain ideally, but there will be those people, unlike your mad professor, who will advocate for China. We could have sought a kind benefactor like the French to do this, as happened in Morocco, but this might have required the sovereign to not just print money, but also be nice to the French, along a range of fronts from trade policy to defence. And as we have seen recently, governments of both persuasions find this a complex matter. Some people did actually suggest bargaining high-speed rail into the bargain with the submarine contract. We could have even had our sovereigns cede some sovereignty and collect a high-speed rail for the bargain of changing our trade policies, our immigration, our foreign affairs, or other aspects of our sovereignty. Your mad professor can see some great deals that could have been done with Japan or Spain or Singapore or other suitable countries. It just happens that some countries are more likely to be able to get the complete package of high-speed rail right from the start, where we cannot. You may not like that, and I'm sure Albo and others had things they didn't like. But at the end of the day, these are all choices. Choices we could have made, like King Mohammed VI of Morocco when he got his high-speed rail from the French. But as in Morocco, this isn't kitchen table economics we are interested in. We are not trying to balance a budget. We don't need to. And we're beginning to see a reflowering of spending on Australian rail. Less worried about the deficit talk of the 1980s and 90s, new leaders like Mark McGowan and Dan Andrews have stepped into the breach to build the railways their predecessors should have built but didn't. Many billions of dollars are now being spent on schemes like the suburban rail loop in Melbourne, Metronet in Perth, Sydney Metro West and Western Sydney Airport lines, to name but a few. Most of the agony these days in government is not whether we can afford these projects, as people know we can, but whether they are the right projects. People are right to look at their cost, because if it doesn't improve productive capacity in the economy, they will be inflationary. Deficits don't matter, but inflation does, because then the money in your pocket will not buy you as many goods and services as it once did, and you will be worse off. But we will only know that productive capacity improves if we see skill levels rise, more sophisticated equipment being used, and more efficient operations overall. And we know that is going to be the case because we see skills development, like the Victorian Tunnelling Centre, to train people to operate tunnelling equipment, or the new rolling stock manufacturing plant at Torbanlea near Maryborough. The Queensland Government, in this case, is actually building the factory for future trains to be built in, ensuring efficient contemporary practices, while allowing the actual operation to be leased to private companies who will build the trains. And all these new rail projects that do not have train drivers show us that rail services can be delivered with less labour. These things will keep pressure off inflation. We know in our heart of hearts that high-speed rail will deliver productive capacity. We see that when we get stuck on the Hume Freeway or the Pacific Motorway Gold Coast bound. We know that we see that with vast queues of people at the airports at Tullamarine or Mascot, trying to get on pointlessly short flights. We know that when young people in places where housing is still affordable, the likes of Albury or Goulburn, should be able to get to a job a short train ride away, but can't. Roads in our suburbs that will become permanently gridlocked with commuters and trucks if nothing is done. The question was never whether we could afford high-speed rail. We could print all the money that was needed. So many more of our remaining episodes will focus on improving Australian railways. So it is important to keep front of mind that if we need money, it is there to be conjured into existence. But we always must make the right choices, ones that build productive capacity and do not add to inflation. So the false narratives that tie this story together can be overcome. We always had money for railways when we made the choice to do so, whether it was the ambitions of John Whitton or John Bradfield, the bloated 1950s, the miserable 1980s, or the expansionary policies of today. We just need to make that choice. In our next episode, we will look more closely at high-speed rail between Melbourne and Brisbane, including what is wrong with the ACON proposal, your mad professor's own radical ideas for a Melbourne to Sydney section, and how high-speed rail could be made to work on a short stretch like Melbourne to Geelong. Next time, in our episode, It's High Time. See you then.